Okay, I hope I am audible to all the students attending this lecture in macroeconomics. We start with a new topic today in semester 3 of macro. This is labor market and the aggregate supply curve. So in the last lecture, we had done the aggregate demand curve. And if all students can recall, the aggregate demand curve was derived from the ISLM market. But the aggregate supply curve is derived from the labor market. So what does aggregate supply curve show? First of all, the aggregate supply curve shows for each price level the quantity of output, which the firms are willing to supply. So the AS curve will show for every price level the quantity of output which all the firms are willing to supply. Today what we are doing? Today we are doing the long run aggregate supply curve. So we are doing the long run AS curve. And within the long run AS curve, we further have two types. One is called the classical aggregate supply curve. The classical aggregate supply curve. So the classical aggregate supply curve is based on the assumption. The classical AS curve is based on the assumption that the labor market is always in equilibrium. The labor market is always in equilibrium at the full employment level. At the full employment level. Since all the labor is fully employed, output in the classical economy cannot be increased beyond the full employment level. Beyond the full employment level of output. Okay, so this is the first type of aggregate supply curve, the long run aggregate supply curve, which we are studying. Now, all of us know that the classical economists believe that economy will always be at the full employment level. That means all the labor force in the economy is fully employed. That means as a firm, if I have to produce more output, that is possible only by hiring more labor, but all the labor is already fully employed. So that means I can hire more labor only by paying them higher wages because that labor is already working for some other firm. If I want to hire that labor, that is possible only by giving them even higher wages. Okay, so since output cannot be increased beyond the full employment level, I can say that the classical aggregate supply curve is vertical at the level of output. The classical aggregate supply curve is vertical at the level of output corresponding to the full employment level of output. corresponding to the full employment level of output. So since output in the economy cannot be increased beyond the full employment level because all the labor is fully employed, therefore the classical aggregate supply curve will be vertical. We can derive that. So let's derive it. So derivation of the classical AS curve. So we have three markets you can see. One is the labor market. So we have three diagrams. Okay. We measure employment here, which we capture by N. N stands for employment. And we capture the wage rate here, which we denote by W. Similarly, we have employment here, which we capture by N, and output, which we capture by Y. And I have output in the last diagram on the horizontal axis, and I have price on the vertical axis. So in the first, this is my labor market, the first diagram. This is my labor demand curve, which is downward sloping. When wage rate falls, firms demand more labor, so labor demand curve is downward sloping. Labor supply curve is upward sloping. Labor supply curve is drawn for a given level of price, P0. Initially, my labor market is in equilibrium at point E0. My wage rate is W0 and my level of employment is N0. Now, corresponding to this level of employment, I have a production function. Output is a function of employment. All of us are familiar with the production function, right? The only thing is we don't have capital here. We have output as a function of employment, and you can see that the production function is concave to the origin because of diminishing marginal productivity of labor. All students know the concept of law of variable proportions, and all of you also know that the production function is concave because of diminishing marginal productivity of labor. As you keep on hiring more and more labor, every additional labor produces lesser and lesser output because of diminishing marginal productivity. And then in the last lecture, we had derived the aggregate demand curve. This was my AD0. It is downward sloping and corresponding to, so my level of output corresponding to the level of employment N0, my level of output is Y0. Okay, so currently the economy is at E0. This is my demand of Y0. This is my output of Y0, and this is my price, P0. Okay, so I'm quickly revising. The first diagram is the labor market. Labor demand curve is downward sloping. Labor supply curve is upward sloping and is drawn for a given level of price level. Initially, the labor market is in equilibrium at point E0. W0 is the wage rate. N0 is the initial level of employment. Corresponding to that, my production function is Y as a function of N. And when N0 amount of employment is there in the economy, the output produces Y0. Okay, in the last diagram, we have the aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping. Initially, the economy is in equilibrium at point E0. Y0 is the equilibrium level of output, and P0 is the initial price level. Now, suppose aggregate demand in the economy goes up. Because of any factor, we can have it. Aggregate demand can go up because of any factor. Suppose G bar went up. All of us know an increase in G bar, government expenditure causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. So what will happen? So this implies AD curve shifts to the right, which implies at the same price T0, there is excess demand. There is excess demand for goods. How will the firms meet this excess demand? Therefore, to meet this excess demand, firm needs to hire more labor. Firm needs to hire more labor. So what will happen? The labor demand curve will shift to the right from ND0 to ND1. Okay. So now, but what is happening? But labor is already fully employed. Therefore, firms can hire more labor. Firms can hire more labor only by bidding up the wages. Firms can hire more labor only by bidding up the wages. Okay. When firms bid up the wages, what happens? Cost of production of the firms increases, because the wages which the firm is paying to the labor is the cost for the firm. So if the firm starts paying higher wages, cost of production of the firms increases. Cost of production of the firms increases, prices increase. When the cost of the firms will increase, to maintain profit margins, firms will also increase the prices. When prices increase, what happens to real wages? The real wage, which is W by P, starts falling. Okay. When prices increase, real wages start falling. When workers supply labor, they don't supply labor based on nominal wage. Workers supply labor based on real wage. Now real wage will start falling, which implies supply of labor by the workers will fall, which implies the supply curve will shift to the left. Supply curve will shift to the left. Till the economy reaches back to the initial level E1. That means when the supply curve of labor shifts to the left, the economy will be back to the full employment level, which is N0. So let me start off with the whole chain once again. Step 1, suppose aggregate demand increases. Aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. At the same price, there is excess demand. At the same price, there is excess demand for goods. To meet this excess demand, firms will demand more labor. So labor demand curve in the diagram, in the first diagram, will shift to the right. Now firms can hire more labor only by paying them higher wages. Why? Because labor is already fully employed. When all the labor is already working, if I need to hire more labor, I need to pay them higher wages to come to my firm and work for me. So as a result, wages of when firm demands more labor, wages go up. When wages go up, price also starts going up. Because when wages go up, cost of production of the firm has gone up. To maintain profit margins, firms will also increase the prices. Now when prices increase, what do workers realize? Workers realize that even if our nominal wages have gone up, prices have also gone up, which have caused our real wage to fall. And workers do not care about nominal wages. Workers care about real wage. So real wages fall. Real wages fall, workers will reduce their supply of labor till the economy reaches back to the full employment level of output. So N0 corresponding to N0, you can see that output is still Y0. That means we move ultimately from E0 to E0 dash, and then we move back to point E1. So my aggregate supply curve is vertical. You can see that in the last diagram, the line I am darkening, this is my aggregate supply curve. It is vertical. So the point to understand is that in the classical economy, since the economy is fully employed, there will be no change in the real factors. What are the real factors here? The real factors here are output and employment. So real factors, output and employment will not change. What will change is only the nominal factors. What are the nominal factors here? The nominal factors are wages and prices. You can see that wages will keep on going up. Prices will keep on going up. But the real factor, which is price, which is output and employment, will remain the same. Guys, I can continue with the process. Labor demand will further go up. But labor is fully employed. Firms can hire it only by increasing the wage, which increases the cost of production, which increases the prices, which reduces the real wage. So my labor supply will further fall. So we move from E1 to E2. We are back to the full employment level N0. That means what do we learn? In the classical economy, we cannot increase the output above the full employment level of output. No matter what happens, economy will return back to the full employment level of output and income. The real factors in the classical economy, like output and employment, will not change. Only the nominal factors will go up. Why? Because when firms plan to produce more, that is possible only by hiring labor. Now, if they hire labor, they will pay them higher packages, wages will go up. If I am the firm and if I know that I have to hire more labor, but I know that labor is already fully employed, how can I hire more labor? Only by paying them higher wages. If I do that, every firm will want to do that. So what will happen in the classical economy? Wages will keep on going up. Prices will keep on going up. But will the output change? No. Will the employment change? No. So this is called as classical dichotomy. If you must have heard this phrase, in the long run, in the classical economy, all what happens is increase in the nominal factors like wages and prices. The real factors in the classical economy will never change. So if I sum up the classical aggregate supply curve, so what do we learn? Conclusion. Under the classical framework, an increase in aggregate demand only has the effect of raising the nominal wages and prices. with no change in the real factors like output and employment in the economy. Hence, the classical aggregate supply curve, the classical AS curve, is vertical at the full employment level of output. The classical AS curve is vertical at the full employment level of output. So I hope all students have understood how we have derived the long run classical AS curve. Now guys, another thing, this whole story will happen only in the long run. Why? Because workers become smart only in the long run. You see, when firms will start paying higher wages, workers will not realize this immediately, that prices will also go up. Always remember, firms can make a fool out of workers in the short run. Suppose you guys are the workers and I am the firm, and suppose we are in the classical economy. Now if there is excess demand, for goods, if I am the firm, I will start hiring more labor. I will hire more labor, I will pay them higher wages. But workers, what will workers think? Workers will think that we are getting higher nominal wages, let's work for them. So in the short run, output will go above the full employment level. But gradually with time, in the long run, the workers will realize that, okay, we are getting higher nominal wages, but prices have also gone up. That means our real wages have gone down. That means they will reduce their supply of labor in the long run, which will cause the output to go back to the full employment level in the long run, not in the short run. In the short run, you can produce the level of output above the full employment level in the classical economy. But ultimately, in the long run, you will go back to the full employment level because workers will eventually become smart in the long run. They will come to know that even if firms are paying us higher nominal wages, prices have also gone up, which implies our purchasing power has gone down. So they will reduce their supply back to the full employment level in the long run. So if firms can make a fool out of workers, that's possible only in the short run, because eventually everyone becomes smart in the long run. Okay. Now let's look at the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. Now, what did Keynes believe? So, the main idea behind the Keynesian AS curve is that unemployment does exist in the economy. All of us know the Great Depression of 1930s. From that moment onward, we started having the Keynesian approach. Before that, we used to have classical approach. So unemployment does exist in the economy. And since unemployment exists in the economy, therefore it is possible for the firms to hire as much labor as they want at the prevailing wage rate. So in the Keynesian economy, firms do not need to increase the wage rate because they know that unemployment exists in the economy. Since unemployment exists in the economy, who has the bargaining power? The firms, not the workers. That means if unemployment exists in the economy, you can hire more labor at the same wage rate. In the classical economy, you had to increase the wage rate. Why? Because labor had the bargaining power. The labor was already fully employed. But now the bargaining power comes with the firms. They know that some of the labor is unemployed. So that labor will be willing to work for us at the same wage rate. That means, therefore, the Keynesian AS curve is perfectly elastic or horizontal. The classical aggregate supply curve was perfectly inelastic or vertical. The Keynesian AS curve is perfectly elastic or horizontal. So if I draw the Keynesian AS curve, it looks like this. Output, price, Keynesian AS curve. And if you look at the chain, since Keynes assumes that unemployment exists in the economy, it implies more labor can be hired at the same wage rate, which implies no change in cost of production of the firms, which implies if there is no change in cost of production of the firms, no change in prices. This implies that at the same price P0, firms are willing to supply as much as demanded. Therefore, the Keynesian AS curve is horizontal. So I hope all the students have understood the Keynesian AS curve. Since unemployment exists in the economy, therefore you can hire more labor at the same wage rate, no change in cost of production of the firms, no change in prices. That means at the same prices, the firm is willing to supply as much as demanded. So Keynesian AS curve is perfectly elastic or horizontal. I hope all the students are clear with this. Okay, now let's move on to the impact of fiscal and monetary expansion on the classical and the Keynesian AS curve. Also, one more thing, students, Keynesian AS curve is also a long run aggregate supply curve. Keynesian AS curve is also a long run aggregate supply curve. So both classical aggregate supply curve and Keynesian aggregate supply curves are long run aggregate supply curves. Okay, because in the long run, it's possible only in the long run that the firm can supply as much as it can. All of us know that in the short run, firm is constrained by fixed factors of production. In the short run, the firm is constrained by fixed factors of production. Only in the long run, the firm can supply as much as it can at the same price level. Okay. So now, anyone has any doubt till now? Please unmute your mic and ask, or you can send me your doubt on chat. Okay, if there are no doubts, I can move forward. Now, let's look at fiscal expansion. Fiscal expansion with the Keynesian AS curve. With the Keynesian AS curve. So let's look at the case. What will happen? So this is my origin. On the horizontal axis, we have output, interest rates, output and price level. Initial IS curve. IS curve is drawn for a given level of, say, government expenditure, G bar, G0 bar, I can say. LM curve is drawn for a given level of real money supply, M0 by P0. Initial equilibrium interest rate, initial equilibrium level of income demanded, Y0. Corresponding to that, we have the initial price level, P0. This is my initial aggregate demand curve, AD0, and my initial aggregate supply curve. Since we are in the Keynesian economy, my aggregate supply curve will be parallel to the x-axis, horizontal. Now, suppose G bar goes up from G0 bar to G1 bar. Fiscal expansion means suppose government expenditure has gone up. All of us know what will happen, right? We know the whole chain. When government expenditure goes up, should I quickly speak it for you? When G bar goes up, output goes up by alpha G times change in G bar, which implies money demand goes up by K change in Y, which implies interest rates go up by K by H times change in Y, which implies investment falls by minus B change in I, which implies output falls by minus B alpha G change in I. Now that whole chain is going to happen, and ultimately where will I reach? This is IS1, G1 bar. Ultimately we will reach from E0 to E1. Now guys, I am not doing the whole chain again because you already know it from the ISLM lecture. Ultimately, we know that we move from point E0 to point E1. So I can write, which implies IS curve shifts to the right from IS0 to IS1, which implies output demanded in the economy, increases from Y0 to Y1, okay, which implies when IS curve shifts in the last lecture of aggregate demand, we had seen that when output demanded goes up, my AD curve will shift to the right. my AD curve will shift to the right parallelly. Okay, so this implies my AD curve shifts to the right from AD0 to AD1, which implies excess aggregate demand. Excess aggregate demand, this is my excess aggregate demand. Now, but under the Keynesian system, more labor can be hired at the same wage rate, which implies no change in cost of production of firms, which implies no change in prices, which implies at the same price, the firm will increase its supply. Therefore, firms will increase its supply so that the economy moves from point E0 to point E1. So what do we observe? We observe that fiscal expansion is successful in increasing the output in the Keynesian economy. I quickly go over the chain. Initially, the economy was in equilibrium at point E0. When government expenditure goes up, IS curve shifts to the right. The whole chain which we have done in the ISLM lecture will happen. Ultimately, the economy moves from point E0 to E1. Output demanded in the economy goes up from Y0 to Y1. As a result, aggregate demand curve will shift from AD0 to AD1, which will lead to excess aggregate demand in the economy. But we are in the Keynesian economy. In the Keynesian economy, firms can hire more labor at the same wage rate. It means no change in cost of production of the firms, no change in prices. It means at the same price, the firms can produce more output so that the economy in equilibrium reaches from point E0 to point E1. Thus, in the Keynesian economy, fiscal expansion is successful in increasing the output in the economy. So I hope all the students are clear with this. Okay. Also, one important thing to remember, this is output demanded. But this denotes output demanded and supplied, because we have the AS curve also. First diagram is only output demanded on the horizontal axis, but the second diagram is output demanded and supplied. So this is where I stop in this lecture. I request all students to leave this meeting and join back using the same link. All join back using the same link.